Hello, I'm Joan. I'm a Canadian family physician who also works as a restorative medical educator, facilitator, and coach. I create spaces that rehumanize the work of healthcare. I'm creating this podcast to remind myself, as well as anyone else working in a helping profession, that when you are working and caring for your human patients, you are the other human in the room. Hello there, healthcare humans. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the Room. I am super excited for this podcast conversation. I know I say that a lot, but it is true today as well. I am a big fan of the person I am speaking to. I've been a fan long before she knew I existed. And now I'm so excited that we know each other exists, and that's even better. I first learned of Krista, who will formally introduce herself in a minute, but through the same kind of coaching community that I did some training in. And the thing I've always appreciated about you, Krista, is your really grounded approach to when I've witnessed you coach others, and it's just I've learned a lot from you. One of my favorite things about training as a coach is how much it has taught me about ways to hold space for my patients, whether I'm coaching them or simply speaking to them and having facilitating a conversation. And I feel like I watched you and learned a lot from you specifically in how you hold space. So thanks for being my teacher before we even knew each other. And then I got to know you in this program we were in together. And I'm just so inspired by what you do. I'm inspired by what's possible, what you can do for a community that often people maybe would feel nervous about trying to support, and how you just do it so incredibly. So I heard you give this speech at this summit thing we were at together, and that in particular gave me the courage to be like, okay, yeah, I need to have Krista on the podcast to talk about grief and what we're kind of maybe misinformed, not fully trained for as folks in healthcare around grief. And so that's what I'm excited to talk to you about today. But before we jump into it, would you please introduce yourself to everyone listening?
Of course. What a lovely introduction. It's such a cool world that we live in, that we can impact people before we even meet them in real life.
Yes.
That's just amazing. So anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I love talking about grief and post-traumatic growth. I don't think we talk about grief enough. So thank you for being willing to talk about grief. So I'm Krista St-Germain. I am a master certified life coach. I host a podcast called the Widowed Mom Podcast. And what I love doing is helping widowed moms who are kind of feeling stuck. You know, they're back to functioning, but they aren't loving life again. And they don't really know how that could be possible to truly love life again. And so that's what I love doing, is helping them love life again. And I didn't really ever, this was not on my bucket list of career goals in my, early days. But when I was 40, I was coming home from a trip with my husband. We had actually only been married for a few months at that point. And it was such a high in my life because my first marriage, of which I'm so grateful for because I had two amazing children from it. But my first marriage did not end well. And Hugo, my second husband, was kind of proof to me that you can be treated the way that you want to be treated, and it can be what you want it to be. And so I was just on this real big high. But we were coming back from a trip, and we had driven separately, and I had a flat tire, and we pulled over on the side of the highway, and he was trying to help me change the tire, didn't want to call AAA, being the stubborn man that he was. And as he was trying to get the tire out of my trunk, a driver that we later found out had meth and alcohol in his system on a Sunday afternoon, full daylight, did not see us and hit the back of our car and trapped him in between his car and mine. And what felt like, this amazing future that I had just kind of ripped out right from under me. And so thankfully I had a great therapist who had helped me when I went through my divorce. And so I immediately went back to her, and that was really, really helpful to me to just have somebody to talk to who didn't, I didn't have to worry about, were they judging me, and how, could I be open with them? And I could just kind of let it all out and talk about it until it actually made sense to me that it really had happened and wasn't just this awful nightmare, Yeah. But then I got to a place where I just felt a little plateaued, where I wasn't really miserable. I was back to work. Everybody was telling me, "Oh, you're doing so great and you're so strong and I can't imagine." And I could understand why they were saying that, because from the outside, it looked like I had it all together and I was doing great. But on the inside, I did not feel great, right? I was like, my best days are probably behind me. I'm never going to really be happy again. I should just be grateful for what I had. I'll live for the kids, that kind of narrative. And I just happened to discover life coaching. Like, well, that's not true. I had listened to a podcast, the Life Coach School podcast, for several years before that, but I never really thought it was, I don't know. I liked it, but
Yeah.
what she offered wasn't really for me. And she happened to launch a program called Self-Coaching Scholars, and I joined it. It wasn't even grief related, but what I learned there was really what I needed. And when I kind of got to a place where I was feeling hopeful again, I thought, I don't really want to be in this career. Hugo and I worked together. He's French Canadian, by the way. And came to where I live in Wichita, Kansas, to work for Bombardier, and I worked there. And so he'd been there for 20 years. I'd only been there for 10, but I was not passionate about aviation. He was, right? He was an engineer through and through, but I didn't care about it. It was just a good job that paid the bills. And so I decided to become a life coach and left that. And then that's what I do full time. It's what I've been doing since 2018. It's just helping widows, and I love it.
Wow.
Love it, love it.
Yeah. And to be able to use like your lived experience and have that be a point of connection for folks where then potentially they'd feel safer to be with you, and then and then use that to help them reclaim whatever it is that they may think they would never get back in their life, and to move forward and have that growth. I just think that's so beautiful.
Yeah. And also to understand what it's like to be on the end of outdated information about grief, right?
Yes.
Because what I know now is so different than what I knew then.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't want other women to have the same experience that I did. I want other people, whether they're widows or not, but I want people to be more informed about grief and what it actually looks like.
Yeah.
So that when they have their own grief experience, which they will, right? And they probably already have, but they have an easier experience of it than so many of us have, because there's so much misinformation and outdated information about grief that really is just so pervasive in our culture.
Ugh. And that's that was sort of the first thing I wanted to really dive into. I think because I was thinking about how relevant grief is, first of all, if you're a human on the planet, period.
Right.
And then for folks in healthcare, whether you're a physician or another type of clinician, but we encounter people living with grief and more openly and perhaps newly living with grief at a rate that's different than some other professions. We may actually be in some ways a catalyst, and that we may have just broken news, and that is, our news isn't us saying it didn't cause the grief, but we're like witnessing their acute grief reaction, all that stuff. And so I would love to hear a bit of what you notice, or some of the major ways that, whether it's with healthcare or professionals in general, ways in which we think grief works versus how you find it more helpful to explain how grief works really in practice.
Yeah. So I think for starters, if it's helpful to look at the definition of grief, because it's so much bigger than I think sometimes we, think it is. So I define grief as the natural human response to a perceived loss. And perceived loss, right? Just that in and of itself is so many different things. So we expected something to go one way and then it went another, and that feels like a loss. That does include, or can include, bereavement, which is when someone dies, but it can also be, a diagnosis. It can be, I thought it was going to go this way and then it went that way. It could be career loss. It can be a divorce. It can be the end of a friendship. It can be so many things. It can even sometimes follow something that we expected, that was a real high. So oftentimes, for instance, if someone is in the process of transitioning, right, and they transition and then they feel they're so happy that they are where they are and have made the choices that they have made. But then along with that might come some grief for, the parts of themselves that are no longer what they were, or the people who are no longer supportive, right? It doesn't always we usually think it's only quote unquote negative. That's not always the case. So I think it's helpful to look at that first of all. And then to just kind of normalize that most of us only know one theory of grief.
Yes.
Right? When I ask people, I mean, you were there in the room when I gave that presentation, I asked people, who's familiar with the 5 stages of grief? Pretty much all the hands go up.
Yep.
Who can tell me any other theory of grief besides the 5 stages? Like 2 people, because they're either in the grief space or like they've heard that before. So, the 5 stages of grief, I think, was so valuable in its time. And Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who created it, was really revolutionary in that in 1969, she was the only one talking about it, right? Or one of the only ones. But what most people don't know is that, first of all, it came from her work studying people who were terminally ill, right? So it was really first about what is it like when you're coming to terms with a terminal diagnosis. So, she was noticing anecdotally, okay, there's this denial phase, and then people get angry, and then they bargain, and then they get depressed, and then eventually they come to acceptance. And she kind of treated acceptance as like a finite place, right? Mm-hmm. And she wrote on grief, or on death and dying, and then later wrote on grief and grieving. And again, very valuable in its time, but we're in 2024 now. Yeah. And there's a lot of other grief work that's been done since then. And what most people find is that the 5 stages is not really representative of their experience. And of course, she in her later work really regretted how people used her work. She never meant for it to be formulaic. She was just getting a conversation started and talking about what she noticed and trying to be helpful. And people took it and went, oh, this is prescriptive. Yes. Right. I'm supposed to do it in this way. Yeah. Well, and I get that.
Often it makes unhelpfully.
It often unhelpful, but I understand, when your world feels like it exploded, don't you want a formula?
Tell me some steps.
Give me some steps. Give me some reassurance. Tell me it's going to get better. So I totally get that. And also not so accurate or helpful, but it is what it is. So I think it's good to know that, most people, that really is all that they know about grief. Most people are using a very narrow definition of grief. And even just knowing that can really, really help other people support people in grief.
Yeah. I think another thing that I'd love to hear your thoughts about is oftentimes, like, whether I'm working with learners, because I do teach medical students and residents, people training to be physicians, and also with clients or even just friends, how one of the things that I hear and I can relate to is I'm not sure what to say. Mm-hmm. I don't know what to say to them. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I'm curious what your thoughts are about that idea, response. I know you may have been on, in some ways, the receiving end of people maybe not saying or being unsure of what to say when you were experiencing grief. And now you say a lot of things to people experiencing grief. Mm-hmm. I'm curious your thoughts about that set of nerves that come up for people when interacting with people in grief.
Yeah, so normal. I think about all the things that I said before Hugo died to other people, that having now been on a different side of it, I wish I wouldn't have said. So I think we all want to show ourselves some compassion and grace for things that we may have said in the past. And, we are imperfect humans who aren't going to get it right. But, if people are listening to your podcast, I think they're probably already steps ahead, because I know that you teach, being present with your own emotion. Mm-hmm. I know that you teach, that feelings aren't problems to solve.
Yes.
Right.
Amen.
And if it's not about what we say, it's about the reason we say what we say. And the reason most people are saying things that come off as platitudes or minimizing is because they're coming from the lens that emotions are problems. They don't know how to feel okay when people they care about don't feel okay. Yeah. And so when we don't know how to feel good when other people aren't, then doesn't it make sense that we would want to try to cheer them up, right? We would want to try to help them find gratitude. We would want to try to change their emotional state. And that's when we say things like, well, they're in a better place, or at least they're no longer suffering, or you're young, you'll find someone else, right? It comes from, I don't know how to feel okay because you don't feel okay. I want you to feel better. So let me try to say the thing. And, we know that that's not what we want to hear. We don't want someone to take away or invalidate or minimize what we're feeling. What we want is a witness. We want people who are willing to be with us. And so many people, we get so worried about what we're going to say, we say nothing, which can sometimes even be worse, because then it's like, it's so dismissive. So to me, it's things like, this sucks, and I love you, right? And I'm here, right? The people who I look back and they were like just willing to be with me, and they didn't try to change my experience or cheer me up, or in a fake way, right? Like cracking jokes, great, but the don't worry, you're young. He would want you to be happy. Ugh.
Can we not, please?
Yeah. Just grief needs a witness, and we can be that for people.
That's one of my favorite words in terms, like the notion of being a compassionate or loving witness to people. It's been the most useful kind of frame or role that I've started actively adopting with patients. Versus what I think, no one explicitly said don't be a witness, but you kind of get other messages, either overt or subvert, like subconscious, that it's like, dominate, direct the conversation, watch out for emotions, learn how to kind of bat it away, learn how to like get the tissue across the table and then move on. Oh, I don't know. And no one's like saying it so explicitly like that, but that's sort of what you're seeing role modeled. And no one, it was rare anyway, to hear sort of like, here's what it's like, and this is how you hold space or just be a witness to that person. And it's very freeing, actually, to know that I don't have to do anything or say the right thing, that instead it's about connecting.
Yeah, just being present. Yeah. So much of it is that.
And it feels good too, actually. I mean, it's sort of funny to say, but it feels hard, and that you're witnessing someone's hard emotions, of course. And so some things coming up for you, but it's actually, I imagine this is your experience. I'd love to hear, like, I mean, you're speaking, I imagine people say like, oh, you're speaking with people who are sad all the time. Isn't that hard? Isn't that heavy? And I know for me, there's times that it's hard and heavy, but also it is joyous work, is my personal experience. And I'm curious about for you. So working with widowed moms, is it heavy and hard all the time? Or what is your experience of working in this way?
I get that feedback a lot of, that's difficult. I don't find it heavy or hard. Yes, the subjects that we're talking about sometimes, and there's a lot of emotion, in the work, but I don't find it draining or hard or difficult at all. And I never really did. It just never was that for me. And to me, it's just about connecting with people and being there with them. Grief is so normal. We were designed to grieve. Right? Like, this is a normal human thing. It's not a problem to solve. It's just part of being human. And so, no, I actually feel rather energized.
Yes, I relate to that. I think what you just said, I just want to repeat it, of like grief being normal. I think, like you say, when we narrow it to bereavement, we narrow it to specific things, and we say, okay, here's how you prepare for the grief conversation, as if grief isn't, even in some small way, present in many, many interactions, especially in the setting where I'm a physician and they're my patients. I mean, something is going to not go as expected, and they may have a natural emotional response to it. Like, based on your definition, like a perceived loss, I am very frequently talking to people about their perceived losses. Because otherwise, loss of function, temporary or permanent, loss of time, because our healthcare system especially in Canada, has weights and they're frustrated. Like,
Mm.
I would say that grief is present in many ways in different forms all the time. And there's something
Mm-hmm.
about normalizing, like, yeah, that this is what happens in with human interactions.
Mm-hmm.
It can make it feel less like scary and charged,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
The other thing, because so I will say for me, I have felt more comfortable like naming grief in rooms and holding space for others, not by learning the perfect language, like you said, but when I learned how to attend to grief in my own life and
Mm-hmm.
like you're saying, just felt comfortable with emotions in general. And I think folks in healthcare, whether they think of it or not, we well again because we're humans will experience grief. Like I hear stories of how our system isn't amazing at holding space for grief, where people feel pressured, you know, maybe they actually have bereavement, someone dies in their family, but they feel pressured to still check the inbox, they feel pressured to go back to work right away or whatever.
Yeah.
So like there's those tricky things where there's not a culture that normalizes and supports people to like hold space for all sorts of grief. But also I think a common thing that, you know, sometimes when we talk about burnout, I think another way to describe that is sort of an accumulation of unprocessed or unacknowledged grief. Like
Mm-hmm.
all the times we talk about like moral distress. So it's like, oh no, I thought I was getting into a profession that would have all the answers, and now I've learned there's actually a bunch of things that are coming through my door that I don't have easy, tidy answers, and all of the people that I thought would be happy and grateful to see me are mad at me and want to sue me. And that's not literally always what it is, but like, you know, when you're really in that
Yeah.
headspace, one way to describe that is that you're grieving what you thought your life would look like.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. That is
And,
grief.
yeah. And so I would love to hear a bit about the models of grief that you find more supportive or a bit more accurate of how to then, so say people listening, they're like, oh gosh, yes, I not only realize I'm seeing grief in my patients but also in myself.
Mm-hmm.
What are some models or ways that you find productive to help people move through grief other than the
Mm-hmm.
stage model?
Yeah. 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 So first, I think it's always important to remind ourselves that the goal is not to get to the end, because there is no
Yeah, move
end.
through is even kind of funny, isn't it?
Right.
What language would you use? I would,
Move
yeah.
forward with.
Ooh, I love
Move
that.
forward with or integrate is
Mm,
the language that I like. Because, you know, so given the definition that I use, right, it's the natural response to a perceived loss. The loss is always going to be there. We're always going to have a response. The
mm,
response, though, can change over time and does. And we
mm,
definitely, you know, can choose our response for sure. But the goal isn't to get to the end, because there isn't an end. So that's helpful no matter what framework you particularly like. My favorite is the dual process model. And the dual process model is super simple and just, I think, so approachable and generous. But it essentially divides all of the things that we do up into two buckets. So there's loss oriented activities. So we're thinking about the loss, we're dealing with the logistics of the loss, we're feeling the feelings about the loss, we're, you know, anything loss related. That's one bucket. And the second bucket is restoration, restorative activities. And those are things that are unrelated to the loss. So that's when we are not thinking about the loss. So we're in nature, we're doing hobbies, we're laughing, we're having Netflix binges, like, right?
mm,
Anything unrelated to the loss. And the dual process model just basically says healing is found in the oscillation,
mm,
the back and forth between the loss oriented and the restorative activities. And so, and I like this because when we come from a productivity mindset, or like me, I got to get the A, right? Like
mm.
I remember thinking, just give me the book and I'm going to get the A in grief. Like I'm going to do this. There was a, right. When you're feeling out of control, and I already had like a kind of, you know, perfectionist nature and a I'll show them kind of personality. But you want control. You
Yeah.
want to prove to yourself that you're going to be okay and you can handle it. And so And then also, most of us have been taught that, our value comes from what we produce and how, productive we are, and get back to it. And so it can be really easy to tell yourself that if you're not thinking about the loss or focusing on the loss, that you're doing something wrong, that you're in denial. And then we bring in the 5 stages and misuse it. And so for people like me, and for a lot of the clients I work with, the dual process model gives us permission to be like, wait a minute, oh, I can do a Netflix binge, and that actually can be a healthy respite. And it's just gentle back and forth, back and forth. And I love that. I also think if we can educate people about secondary losses, that can be helpful too, right? So the primary loss is, in my case, my husband died, primary loss. So whatever the first loss is, the main loss. The secondary losses are all the losses that happen as a result of the primary one. And those are the reason it's important to talk about that, is because each one of those secondary losses is really a loss in its own right. And those losses will keep coming forever. Yeah. And if you're prepared for that, it's easier when they happen. If you're not, it's easy to say, ooh, I must be doing it wrong, right? I should be further along than I am.
I'm not like, healed enough.
Right. And then we're like, I don't think I got to the stage of acceptance, which, by the way, is not a place. Right. So it's okay. He died. And then, but then 5 years from now, my daughter's going to get married. Maybe, I don't know. Right.
Yeah.
In my mind, he was supposed to be there, or the trips we were supposed to take, or the dreams that we had that didn't get realized. Those are all their own unique losses. And because those can't be anticipated always and just keep coming, then when you get there, and if you feel a gut punch from that, or, grief shows itself again, and that, then you can be the witness for yourself. You can comfort yourself and remind yourself, oh, of course, like, this is the part where I have a secondary loss. And of course, this doesn't mean that I ignored my feelings, or I'm in denial, or something's wrong with me. It's just, this is the way of grief. And, those things make grief easier to me.
I love that. Have you heard, I think it's a somatic experiencing term. I actually don't know if it's only used there or whatever, but like the idea of pendulation. Yeah, just that sounds the exact same. Like, that's where, well, the way I've heard it described is like, there's a hurt part inside of you, like where a painful emotion is connected. And so one thing you can literally do in the moment is find another part of your body that's feeling less intense, that less direct pain. And then you sort of sit with the awareness and sort of feel that area out. And then you pendulate like a pendulum, like back and forth oscillation. And that is back like a practice. I've been doing it with my like somatic experiencing therapist, like going back and forth. And like what you're describing is how your whole life you could consider basically doing that same pendulation, and that is a healing rhythm, not healing like to get somewhere, but that's a rhythm that can help you integrate.
Yeah. What's that been like for you?
So good. I use it so often in like, well, I love learning something that's like technically an internal process, like this pendulation thing. I've learned it from a few different teachers, and then now with my therapist. And it certainly helps in the moment to like kind of dissipate the emotion, process and integrate the emotion, whatever it is, recognize that my body is resourceful and can help herself out. That's also a really cool piece of it, where it's like, I'm not having to reach for something outside of myself per se.
Yeah.
And then I love to reflect on how in so many ways in my life, especially as I've created space for me and my humanity and for joy and for Taylor Swift, for example, that one of the things that's come up for me is feeling some of the socialized guilt, or like, oh, this is a waste of time, or this is silly. But it's neat to think of that, like, these are my restorative activities, like that pendulation, that is helpful to then also do serious work of processing whatever trauma, blah, blah, blah. But like that there's like, I just love thinking about how it works internally and externally, because that's what I found. Like the truths that I found to be the truest for me are things that work internally and externally in equal measure. And so I love when I first heard you describe this model, like at that summit, and especially when you use the word restorative, and I call myself a restorative medical educator. I feel like want to try and offer is the restoration part for people.
Yeah.
I was like, well, yes, that's very affirming.
Yeah, it is. And it's gentle, and it's approachable, and yeah.
Yes. It's two things. That's all you have to remember. You're not like
Uh-huh.
remembering a
Yeah.
complex diagram. It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
complicated.
And I think sometimes I see so much unnecessary suffering too when we have this narrow definition of the emotions that we think we're supposed to experience in grief, and then we experience emotions that aren't, in that
Mm.
narrow definition. So like joy,
Mm.
relief, happiness.
Tricky
Um,
sometimes. Yeah.
it can be if and it's worse, of course, because we're not expecting them, and then we make them mean things.
Mm.
But I also like the dual process model because it not only makes room for those things, but it prioritizes them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That actually leads well to I was wanting to circle back to what you'd said near the beginning. Like a lot of your clients feel stuck
Hmm.
and that stuckness. And then what you're offering to them is growth, like post traumatic growth, as you say. Um, I think that could be relatable to a lot of people listening. A lot of people, whether it's due to a specific grief, loss, or bereavement, or
Hmm.
just feeling stuck in patterns of their life.
Yeah.
And I know for me, one of the things that held me back was feeling like it was sort of wrong or not allowed or meant something, betraying a past self. In I think I've heard you speak of like folks who have lost someone, like betraying that person. If you then find happiness after them, you know, what if you actually
Hmm.
like the version of yourself you become without them, and what you make that kind of stuff mean?
Yeah.
I know I've had versions, not specifically to like a lost loved one, but as I've found happiness, like sometimes I feel guilty or bad, or it means that my past self was stupid or wrong. I would just
Hmm.
love, there's not a specific question in there, but like, is this, do you notice this phenomenon happening amongst the people that you
All the time.
coach? And,
Yeah.
what are some pathways or ways that people can get from the stuckness to the growth?
Yeah. Gosh, there's so much in there. I feel like
I
this
think
could
that's
be
like
a
literally
huge
everything you do. So maybe it's
conversation.
an unfair question.
No, but I love it. I love it. We'll cover all that we can.
Mhm.
Um, okay, so first, yeah, super, super normal. For the clients that I work with, right, grief is the doorway. It is the doorway to what ultimately ends up being a very liberatory experience.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
it always ends up being so much more than grief. But I think it's so common that I see somebody creating some sort of positive change that they really do want for themselves, and figuring out how to live a life that is more aligned with what they value, right? And then looking back and experiencing grief over that.
Mhm.
Because what would
Yes.
it have been like if they were living that life with that person?
Mm.
What
Yes.
what if they had known then what they know now? Could they have helped that person?
Oof. Yes.
And so it is,
Yeah.
yeah, it seems like it would just be like, oh, happy, we're creating a new sense of purpose, and we're going to feel excited about life and joyful again. It's going to be amazing. And really what it is oftentimes is, yes, it is that. And it's also like more grief of then, wow, what if I had had these tools then? What could our relationship have been like? Could we have had the valuable conversations I wish we'd had? Could I have, so many of the women that I work with lost their person to suicide, and could I have made a difference there? And so, yeah, normal. Um, and sometimes I think what holds people back too is they associate creating more of what they want in the future. They make it mean that they didn't value what they had in the past.
Yes. And you're betraying the past in
Yeah, when
some way.
it's not like that at all. I
Mm.
always love using the idea of a tornado. Um,
Mm.
I live in Kansas. We have tornadoes here. So, but to me, it's like if you live in a house and a tornado comes and it knocks down your house, you didn't ask for that tornado.
Yeah.
You're not grateful that that tornado came, but it did. And then you're going to need a place to live. You could try to build something as close to what you had. That would be fine. You could also, and would most likely, because you'd lived there for a while and learned something, maybe you didn't have a storage, a shelter. And
Right.
you've learned, okay, I would like one of those, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe it's simple things. I want more light in the kitchen. I want more space in the closet. But you update the design according to what you have learned from your life experience. That doesn't mean you didn't like the old house, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you wanted the tornado. That just means we always get to keep making changes and choices that take us, toward what we want based on what we've learned. And that's post-traumatic growth. So, relationships are often a huge area of post-traumatic growth after you've experienced some sort of grief, and that, maybe the people that you thought were your ride or dies were going to be there and they weren't. And then you realize, oh, maybe this isn't actually the relationship I want to be in. Or, you kind of realize maybe I've been going through the motions with this relationship and I've just been, holding on to it because I have some thoughts about the investment that I've already put in, or some shoulds about how long we've known each other. But really it's not filling me anymore. I don't want to be in relationship with this person, or I want to right size my relationship with this person, it's a wake-up call sometimes, a significant grief experience, right? Where you're like going through the motions of life, and then the record scratches and you're like, oh, wait a minute. Okay. If life is this precious, if it really is delicate and precarious, am I being who I want to be? Am I doing what I want to do? Right. That's definitely what it was for me in my career. I was like, this is okay and it's paying the bills, but I don't feel particularly fulfilled here. I don't think I'm leaving the mark on the world that I would really like to leave. But it doesn't have to be grand either. It doesn't have to be like, I have clients who like start nonprofits and, go do these amazing things. And then other people get intimidated by that and think, oh, post-traumatic growth has to be this big thing. No, it can literally be like, I set a boundary with this person,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Yeah, it can be in all the smallest of things. But if we can stop making what we choose in the future mean something about who we were in the past, or whether we cared about that person or that thing that we lost, that will really help, right? We're just always humans that get to choose how we want to be, and we keep iterating based on what we've learned, and we keep making choices that lead us more towards being, the examples of what we value. And that's really what it's about.
I just had like 50 billion goosebumps. That was so good. I love that so much. I think, and if nothing, like say we want to tell a story, like what better way to honor whatever came before, whatever version of yourself or whatever person that's no longer in your life or whatever thing, like then to not pretend you didn't learn from it. Like, right.
Yeah.
If you want to say anything, like it can be the opposite of a betrayal. It can be a way of honoring what's happened to you in the past, right?
That actually, as you say that, it kind of reminds me too that sometimes another blocker can be that we might find ourselves wanting to do things that are in opposition with the relationship that we had, or whatever that thing was, right? Like Hugo would have not liked the idea of me being a life coach.
He would have had opinions.
He would have had opinions. He was not so much on that. So, I that was really something I had to work through, is I could hear him being like, don't leave Learjet. What are you doing? Like, money on the table. This is secure. Like, why would you do that? For what? And so, but again, I think that is in and of itself, can I lean in even more to letting myself have what I want, as opposed to, doing things for external approval, which for some of us is huge growth.
Definitely my journey in the past number of years is like, one way to sum it up is just like continuing deeper discovery of like figuring out how to even know what I want, and then doing the work of like honoring what I want in increasing ways. The other thing I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about what you mean by right sizing a relationship. Because I think that's a cool term.
Yeah, I just mean, so sometimes we tend to think about relationships in very black or white terms,
Yeah.
so like we're either all in or we're all out, or, we're super close or we don't talk at all. And I think there's just a lot of room for, nuance
Mm-hmm.
in that. And so just because we might still choose to be in relationship with someone doesn't necessarily mean we want it to continue in exactly the same way. And I think we can look at it as, right sizing. So, maybe I texted this person every day because it was habit, but I don't really want to. Maybe now I
Yeah.
text them once a week, or
Mm-hmm.
it's can I make the size of the relationship and the energy that I give to it align with how important it is to me, or what the energy that I want to put into it. So that's how I
Yes.
think of it.
I just love that terminology. And for everyone listening, if you're mainly thinking of an interpersonal relationship, I would invite you to also like rewind and re-listen to what Krista just said, but for your relationship with your work, like right
Mm-hmm.
sizing your relationship to your work. A lot of people, I think because it was my journey, so people who come to me, they have a real difficulty considering that there are options for a relationship to how they work. You either have to work full on day and night, never take
Mm.
a day off because you're there and you're important and you're needed. And it's very honestly codependent relationships that we
Yeah.
form with not just individually with patients, but with like the project of medicine. And then they reach a point where then they get out altogether, right? Like it's like black or white. But just what
Mm-hmm.
you just said, like, what if there's the option to right size like the hours you work or what
Yeah.
kind of work? Like there's so many things in between,
Yeah.
nuance.
Yeah. Based on what you value and the lifestyle that you want and the energy that you have and your level of
Yes.
physical wellness and like whatever it is that's going on for you individually. And yeah.
And there can be different right sizes because often we are told like the whole like need to be full. Oh, I've heard from multiple people, us doctors working 70 plus hours. And I'm like, I don't work that. Like, does that mean I'm not a
Mm-hmm.
doctor? Or like, whatever. We have these like cultural norms that
Yeah.
are tricky because we're all individual humans. And what if we all get to right size our relationships in every domain
Mm-hmm.
with an individual patient potentially if the way in which a particular relationship isn't feeling like it's productive, right sizing that with colleagues, and then like with how much you work all together.
Mm.
Again,
I
it just
love
feels like
that.
one of those principles that's like you can
Mm-hmm.
expand
Yeah.
it
And
in and out.
also is not stagnant, right? Is a
Oh
living,
no.
breathing,
Yes.
ever evolving thing that we want to keep our, finger on the pulse of and keep iterating.
Yeah, like it would be completely dynamic in that same
Yeah.
way. Oh, so good. Ah. All right. I'm thinking about um I think that those were like the main core questions I wanted to ask you about grief.
Amazing.
Um I was wondering then, usually I end the podcast with two questions. The last question is going to be like where people find you. But before that, I love to have you kind of imagine. So folks listening, most of them work in healthcare, though some don't. Um, I think the core audience that keep coming back are people who are wondering how to be more in touch with their humanity, in particular in
Mm.
relationship to their work in some kind of helping profession, and are finding it tricky because of all of the inhuman stories we're told about how much we need to work, what that work has to
Mm.
look like, and feeling like they have to sacrifice their humanness and their connection with themselves in the process. And so particularly if when people listen to this conversation they think, gosh, okay, so I think a lot of what I've been experiencing is grief,
Mm.
outwards and inwards. Is there any words of encouragement or advice you'd like to offer to them as they continue on their journey figuring out how to
Mm-hmm.
integrate grief into their lives?
Yeah, I think because of the stigma that comes sometimes with the word grief, that I can imagine someone listening might be thinking, oof, grief. And then that, that's kind of followed with this daunting
Mm.
foreshadowing. I don't know, might feel heavy. And again, just coming back to naming it is even just by itself, such progress. And we don't have to treat it as some big scary thing that we have unearthed that is now problematic and we need to solve. Again, as humans, we were designed for this. By all means, if there's something you feel like you need support around or would benefit from support around, get it. Yeah. And also, we don't have to treat it as this big, hairy, scary thing. And relate to it as though something has gone wrong. It's just like, oh, okay, well, I discovered that there's some grief there and I didn't know that. Okay, I wonder what next would feel useful or helpful to me, And it can be small and not so heavy.
I love that. Thank you so much for offering your wisdom and like multiple mind-blowing. I wrote down so many things.
You're so kind. I'm so happy to have been
I know
here.
it will be helpful for others because it was helpful for me. If folks want to like check you out, listen to your podcast or follow your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, the podcast is called the Widowed Mom Podcast, which I realize is very niched sounding. But I have lots of listeners who are not widows or moms and just want to learn about grief and post-traumatic growth and the things that I teach. So for sure, they can come and listen. For sure, if you have a widow in your world, I would be so honored if you would, tell them that the podcast exists. And then Coaching with Krista is where all the things can be found. So I have quite a lot of free resources, and all of those can be accessed on my website.
So good. Thank you so much. I just love everything about you and the energy you bring and the clarity in which you teach the stuff that I think people can get really tangled in the emotions of. Yeah. And when I hear you talk, I'm like, it is all. Not that it's not heavy or emotional, but there's clarity through all that emotion. You don't have
doesn't
to
have to be something we like tiptoe around.
Yeah, because that's what makes it so big, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, right? Yeah,
so
totally.
It's not. Just walk around. It's okay.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. All right. For those listening, please make sure you check out Krista and think about if there's a relationship that you want to work on right sizing in your life. I know that I just am like, that was a really great little insight that I'm going to think about more. And we'll talk to you next week. I would love to take this work deeper with you. Visit joanchanmd.com today and discover my growing menu of options for restorative medical education to suit your learning needs. I offer one-on-one coaching, customized workshops, and self-study courses that allow you to connect not only with my work on a deeper level, but also with other healthcare humans just like you. So if you want to start humanizing your work in healthcare to a deeper level and do it in community with others, please visit joanchanmd.com and find those options and what fits you and your life today.